Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be reading from Acts chapter 7. And if you want to follow along, I'll be in verses 17 to 37. We're going to be looking into the character Moses a little bit here. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. At that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him in and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came up to 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt." This is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, "Who made you ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself, through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, "God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people."
Thank you, Grant. Thank you to the worship team as well for leading us. And it is a little weird to just be a few of us here in the building. I know there's lots at home watching, but you did great today. I just want to give a thank you and for helping me at least come in to the presence of God this morning and just be reminded of his faithfulness. And I hope the same is true for you at home. One of the other, Jesus is probably the most famous character in the New Testament, in the Bible. Lots of people know him. But if you were to ask the question, well, who's the number 2 most famous individual known from the Bible? Moses has to be right up there. Moses is one of the big guys. He is, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, he almost has at times kind of Jesus level of authority and acceptance in the body of the ancient Hebrews and the Jewish community, even to today. There's an authority that he has. And as we've been learning over the last couple of weeks, as we start this series on the book of Numbers, we need to understand some of the characters and individuals. And so Numbers chapter 1, it'll come up on the screen, and I'll read that for us. But it says that the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness. And so we want to just kind of stop there and ask the question, who is Moses? Because if this is your first time coming to the book of Numbers, Numbers is assuming you know who Moses is. You know his backstory. You know what's going on at this point in the life of Moses and about what's to come. Now remember, the book of Numbers is really part 2 of from Exodus. So Exodus is kind of part 1. The book of Numbers, which we're walking into, or in some introductory pieces right now, is part 2 of that story of the book of Exodus. And so today we're going to ask this question, it'll be up on the screen here, of who is Moses? And when you think of Moses' story, I want you to think of 3 boxes. So in the first box over here is the first roughly 40 years. The numbers don't quite work out to 40 exactly, but roughly 40 years. And then in the second box is he has another set of 40 years, which we'll talk about in the wilderness. And then the 40 years, which is basically the book of Numbers, and that is kind of the last season of his life. And depending on where we are in our own journey, one of the questions we have to wrestle with is you know, if Moses' life was an analogy for my own life, where would I be in the first or second or third? And I actually think in the conversation around our spiritual formation, even though Moses' story is linear, that's not really how it works in our spiritual life. And, you know, maybe you're in box 1 or over in box 3, but then end up finding yourself in box 1 again. We can kind of move throughout that. And so there's some differences that take place. Dwight L. Moody shares, he made this quote about Moses, and it'll come up on the screen. Moses spent his first 40 years, so that's the first box, his first 40 years, thinking he was somebody. Then he spent his second 40 years learning he was nobody. And then he spent his third 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. And that's kind of the journey that God's going to take us through. Depending on our season and circumstances, we might bounce between these. But Moses' story is going to reflect our story. We're not called to be Moses. One of the dangers of even a message like this is, you know, getting to the end and you know, pastors or teachers going, hey, be like Moses. I'm not asking you to be like Moses. I don't want you to be like Moses. You are not Moses, and don't try to be Moses. But what we can learn from Moses' story is that God is looking for men and women who will yield to his purposes and who will seize the day for his glory. You are not Moses. I am not Moses. God is not calling us to be Moses. But God is looking for men and women who will yield to his purposes and who will seize the day for his glory. And so I want you to be open as you listen to his story, to see your own self in the midst of that, but also to listen for what is God asking me to do in the midst of this season? Where is he pushing me? What do I need to work on? So let's talk about Moses' story. The first box takes place in Egypt. This is where everything started. And remember the story, it's connected into the book of Exodus. Well, this story begins in Exodus, but it's connected into the book of Genesis. And so the story comes out of the story of Genesis, and we come into Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2, and God's people are slaves in Egypt. And Moses is born a Hebrew. That's important because it gives us a context. It helps us understand a time of when he was born and where he was born. And he was born a slave. He was born a Hebrew. He was part of what is known as the tribe of Levi. Now, Levi, a couple weeks ago, we said the tribe of Levi is important. As we're going to see in the book of Numbers, the tribe of Levi was the priest tribe. These were the people that took care of the tent of meetings or the tabernacle, eventually the temple, all the sacrifices. They were the religious people in the sense that called the community back to the law, to obedience, to remember who God had called them to. And they, you know, if you look at their history, they sometimes did the right thing and sometimes didn't. We'll talk about that as the weeks go on. But Moses was a priest. He comes out of the priest family. Moses was also youngest of 3 children. Who's the youngest? You can let us know in the chat. The youngest of 3 children. You know what it's like to be kind of the youngest child. think in my home, I was the oldest child, and I know that my younger sister seemed to probably get away with a little more than I did at times. I know my kids would probably say my youngest son gets away with a little more, but you know what it's like. So he's positioned as the youngest child, and the scriptures tell us this, that when Moses was born, that his parents hid him for 3 months. Now think about that for a moment. We've had some babies born in the life of our church, a couple of families. We got at least one more coming that I know of, and I don't think there's been a birth yet. But imagine early on trying to hide a young baby. Like, I remember moments when my kids were young. We had a little different story because they were in the hospital for a couple of months to start off with. But I remember once they got home, like, I was up in the middle of the night. Those kids cried at strange hours, and I fell asleep trying to feed them, and just trying to get sleep is hard enough. And then you got to hide this little baby in the midst of that moment. Why were they hiding him? It's a good question. I'm glad you asked. They were hiding him because Egypt, the Pharaoh, had gone to the midwives and said, hey, when male children are born, as they're coming, we want you to kill them right away. So it looks like they're stillborn. And if it's females, we don't care. They were trying to squash the population of the Hebrews. And if you know the story, they didn't listen, and God was faithful and took care of them. But they're trying to hide Moses because they don't want him to be killed. But it gets to this point in Moses' life where 4 months in, and they can't hide him anymore. And his mom and dad come up with this plan to put him in a basket. You probably know this story. They put him in a basket, and they send him down the river. Now, if you read the text, at first a fast read looks like, what are they doing? But the event that's about to come seems to be that they are trusting that God will guide this child. And they are trusting that God's mercy will be seen for this child. But they also know that could be the end for this child. You see, they knew that at a certain point in the time of day, at a certain time of the week maybe, there was Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter is pretty consistent. She would come down and bathe in the river. And this was about the time that Moses should pass by. They knew she would be there. I should also mention that Moses' sister is following along from a distance, kind of watching this take place, watching her baby brother float down the river. Pharaoh's daughter finds this little baby. And of course, in this moment, there's really kind of two choices. Because the order is to kill these babies, and she knew right away it was a Hebrew baby. And so she could have just pushed him down under the water, and nobody would have asked anything. End of the story, wouldn't have ever heard of Moses. But it seems that the prayers of the parents are answered. And Pharaoh's daughter has mercy upon this little baby and adopts the baby into her home. And because of that, Moses is now raised as royalty in the midst of the Egyptian culture. He is a man that, well, once he becomes a man, who will have a foot in both worlds. He'll have a foot as a Hebrew, and he'll also have a foot as royalty. He is educated. He's equipped. He's being trained to lead. Some believe that he led the Egyptian army at times into battle, eventually. But in this moment, when the daughter finds him, when the daughter Pharaoh adopts him, Moses' sister, and I had forgot about this, and maybe I knew this, but it kind of made me smile just to see how God's hand is at work. As Moses' sister speaks up to Pharaoh's daughter and says, "Hey, would you like some help in caring for your new son? Would you like me to go and find a Hebrew nurse?" This is why it makes me think maybe Moses' family had some kind of relationship with the family to be able to, or with the Pharaoh's daughter to be able to speak. Maybe they were servants, and I don't know all the dynamics that were going on there. I'm reading into it a little bit. But what we see is that Pharaoh's daughter says, "Yes, go and find me a Hebrew nurse." Now, do you know who she goes and gets? Do you know the story? For those who know it, some of you, I know this is like the first time you're hearing it. Do you know who she gets? If you do, put it in the chat. I'll give you a quick second here. She goes and gets his mom, his biological mom. And his biological mom, for a number of months, raises this baby, teaches him a little, as much as she can as he's young, impacts his life, and then one day, Pharaoh's daughter comes and says it's time for him to live in the palace. And this is where he's educated, and he's brought up in the ways of the Egyptian culture. And what the scriptures teach us is that he becomes a man of power. If you remember, Grant just read this. He was a man who was powerful in speech. He was a man who was powerful in his deeds. We read this in Acts chapter 7. I mentioned it already, how he was a man who probably led the Egyptian army into parts. He was being trained. There's some scholars who think that perhaps Moses was being equipped and raised up to potentially be a leader, a significant leader in the Egyptian culture and that kingdom at the time. But in Acts chapter 7, verse 23, it reminds us that God's still at work in Moses' life. This man who has a foot in both worlds. He has this stirring, verse 23 of Acts 7, he has this stirring in him. It says it entered his mind to visit his people. God was at work. I don't know if Moses knew that, but God was stirring him. And at this point, we enter into what is known as where Moses becomes a murderer and a runner. Because there's these scenes that take place where Moses, he had seen this before. Moses sees one of the slave masters, beating upon one of his Hebrew brothers. And something snaps in this man. Something goes off and he's had enough. Now, the Acts chapter 7 kind of gives us a little bit of indication that he was starting to hear God's call in his life. He was starting to believe that maybe God might use him one day to free his people, and maybe this is the moment. And it says in Exodus, he looked both ways. He knew what he was about to do would not be looked on lightly or in a good way. And he beats that man to death. And he covers him up. Remember, this is a man of power. This is a man who was educated, who could snap his fingers and servants would do whatever he wanted. This was a man who could say anything and people would obey, but something in this moment shifted in him, and his world is about to turn and flip upside down. In that first 40 years, this is how it ends. Exodus tells us that the Pharaoh tried to kill Moses. He was upset because of this. He's undermining the king's authority in this moment. And so because of this one choice, it changes his life forever. My wife and I this week, and I don't know if we were listening to the radio, we were definitely in the car because that's where we had the conversation. But there's this, my wife, we were listening to something and then we asked each other this question. And it's a great question for you maybe at lunch today or in your small groups or in your huddle to ask those that you're with. What are some choices? Or what is one choice or two choices that you have made in your life that have completely changed everything? Maybe there's good choices. You know, you decided to do this, to go left instead of right, and all these neat things happen. You know, maybe it's a choice. I decided to do this, and then things just started to fall apart from there. Maybe it could be either way. Maybe you got both of those things in your life. You have moments of choices and circumstances that took place that completely affected the whole direction of your life. And good or bad, you're reaping the consequences of that today. Moses made a choice that completely changed his whole life and forced him into exile, forced him into a time of searching. And this is where we come into the second season of his life. The 40 years in the desert. So the first part is time in Egypt. The second box is 40 years in the desert. It's here that Moses moves from the palace to the wilderness. He moves from the palace to the wilderness. Be 2 slides ahead there, Nathaniel. This isn't an easy road for him to walk. This is a road, sometimes we think the wilderness is like, come on, he had people with him. No, remember, he had food. He has no food. The wilderness, if you look at pictures of what the wilderness looked like over there, it was barren, it was rough, it was hard. Now, he probably knew how to survive. Probably learned some things in the army when he was there. But he couldn't just walk into the kitchen or demand someone to bring him food. And, had to go find his own water and shelter, protect himself from the elements and the animals that existed. The wilderness in the scriptures is known as it's not just a physical place, but it's a spiritual place. It's this place that we go to at times where we can feel life is over. Moses was he probably was a little disillusioned at this moment. He was probably thinking, what good am I anymore? Remember the quote I talked about, this is the moment of humility is starting to be learned in the midst of his life. Spiritually speaking, the wilderness in the biblical story is known as a time of training. It's not all bad, but it could be. When we're in the midst of a wilderness, we have two choices. We can whine and complain and play the victim card, or we can learn and we can grow. Because it's in the wilderness, we need to understand, it's in the wilderness that character starts to be shaped. It's in the wilderness that Moses is forced to learn even more about who he is and who God's calling him to be. One of the writers of the Psalms writes this in Psalm chapter 119, verses 67 to 68. He writes, and I don't know if he's reflecting on Moses, but he's reflecting on a wilderness moment. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey your words. You are good, and what you do is good. Teach me your decrees. And then verses 71 to 72. It was good for me to be afflicted. If we think of Moses for a moment, it was good for me to be in the wilderness. It was good for me to be afflicted, the author writes, so that I might learn your decrees. And then verse 72, the law from your mouth is more precious to me than thousands of pieces of silver and gold. It's in the wilderness that Moses is being reshaped. It's in the wilderness that Moses learns that experiencing failure prompts an obedient life. It's in the wilderness that he is learning with this experience that of failure prompts a teachable spirit. Maybe you've had those moments where you've had to be brought down. You've had to lose in order to understand Jesus. This was a stripping away moment. And what I've learned is in those moments is a couple things happen. Either we become teachable or our hearts become harder. This is why in the book of Hebrews, the New Testament authors say, hey, do you remember the story in the book of Numbers and Exodus when they went into the wilderness? And the reason they were in the wilderness was because they hardened their hearts. And while in the wilderness, there was an option that they could have gone into the promised land. They could have walked deeper into the purposes and yield to the purposes of God, but they didn't because they hardened their hearts. That can happen in the wilderness. There's a choice. And the scriptures promise that in the valley, Jesus, think of Psalm 23, in the valley the shepherd meets us. And he wants to lead us out. Sometimes he leaves us in the wilderness for a little while, by the way. Psalm 23, it says that he sets a table up while we're in the valley. We're like, can you just get me out of here? He's like, no, let's eat. There's some things we need to talk about. And it's here that Moses sits down by a well, and it changes his life forever. It's during this season that Moses goes to draw water, and he sees some men, for the most part, abusing some women. And you remember, God's at work. God's already been shaping his character, and he stands up for that injustice. He steps in to defend those women. They go back and tell their father, and their father says, why did you leave him there? Go and get him and bring him back. And it's here that Moses is introduced to Jethro's family. Moses decides to stay with them. Eventually marries one of Jethro's daughters, and they have kids. And Moses learns the trade of shepherding. Something I learned this week about shepherding is those who are in Egypt, The Egyptians tended to look down upon shepherds. But when you get to, and then you find Moses becomes one of those people that they are looking down upon. Moses is kind of hit at the lowest of lows, but the text gives us this image that he's becoming comfortable. He's kind of accepted where he's at in life. He's accepted what he's lost. He's established a new routine and a new life. And then when he's 80 years old, he's at this mountain watching over a sheep, and there's this bush that's burning but not burning. And it's there that he encounters God. It was read in Acts chapter 7 when Grant read that an angel appeared to him. God had a message for him. Did you catch the part that said he was 80 years old? Ministry never stops. And I want to encourage you, maybe you are just about to enter into some incredible seasons of ministry in your life. I'll guarantee ministry looks different depending on your age and different seasons of life. Resources, skill sets that you have. But never underestimate the reality that God is looking for men and women who will yield to his purposes. And that is not based on age. Don't ever think because of this, I can't do this. Because if you know the story of Moses, that's what he said. At 80 years old, he said, I can't. You want me to go back and free my people. This is what God was asking. I can't go do that. Here's the whole laundry list of reasons why. And literally God's like, no, you don't seem to understand what's going on. I am sending you to do this task. Yes, Moses says, but I can't. And here's the reason. No, you don't understand. Because I'm sending you, you can do this. And eventually Moses, who has moved from this man of power to this man with nothing, this is almost another conversion moment, some have wondered, or the conversion moment for Moses, as he accepts this call and he yields to God's purposes in his life. And today I promise you that God is still looking for men and women who will yield to his purposes, who will be spiritual leaders in our community. Maybe you're not going to stand on a stage like this. Maybe your spiritual leadership is going to be to your family or in your workplace. But God is looking, by the way, spiritual leadership it's about people, moving people onto God's agenda. That's all it is. It's not, having all the words to say or speaking eloquent. It's about pushing and pointing those in our life, helping them get onto the agenda of God. That's all it is. And this is what Moses was being called to do, was to move God's people to his agenda. And so second part ends with him moving into that. Then we get into so we got the first 40 years, second, we're into the third part here. And this is really where the book of Numbers comes into play. 40 years with the Hebrew people in the wilderness. Now again, these numbers aren't exact, but roughly this is kind of how it works. And Moses at this point, and we're going to look at this in the weeks ahead, he's brought the people out of Egypt, some incredible miracle stories. You got to go back and read the book of Exodus for this. They get to the mountain. This is where the 10 Commandments happen. This is, if you've watched the movies, you've seen this, where Moses gets angry because the people kind of rebel, and he throws the 10 Commandments down at them, and then he's got to spend time up in the mountain again, and it's an incredible experience that takes place. But Moses takes the people back to the place where he met God. And he's trying to push them back to God's agenda. And then Numbers starts. Remember back in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses while they were in the wilderness at the mountain. And what he does in this moment is he says, okay, let's get the people ready for the next phase. Because we're going to go take the promised land. And this is kind of where the book of Numbers begins. And it's as the people, as we're going to read, God's agenda with his people is to change their culture, is to shape them, just as Moses was being changed and shaped in all of those seasons. God is now going to use him and other leaders in the life of his people to change them and to shape and form them, because there's purpose for them. God's got things he wants them to do. They are a people who are on a pilgrimage. They're present in this world, but they're called to live in a different way. And God's going to teach them how to do that. Moses is a major player in the Old Testament. He is the foundation of some of the beliefs that we have, and his writings have impacted us to this day. Eventually, Moses understands that the people might start to raise him up higher than he should be, and God speaks through him, and he declares, hey, you want to know, I know you think highly of me at this point. They didn't early on in his life, but there's somebody greater who is going to come. The end of the book of Deuteronomy. He says that there is a prophet that will be raised up amongst our people who will be like me, but he will be greater. The book of Numbers picks up on this. Because by the time we get to the New Testament, Moses is like, he's not God, but he almost has this godlike status. Everything's compared to Moses. He's the authority. And let's face it, he's the guy that established the Old Covenant, this way of relating to God, the Ten Commandments and all the, I think it's 613 rules all around that, the temple rituals, so that God would dwell with his people. And then Jesus shows up, this greater prophet that Moses speaks about, and changes everything. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus, in the Holy of Holies, there was this curtain that separated God's people, us, from entering the presence of God. And it says in the Scriptures in the New Testament, when Jesus died, that curtain was ripped in half. And Jesus opened up a new way for us to walk with God. That you and I can speak to him directly. Jesus says that when we follow him, that same Spirit that rested in the temple that we read about in the Old Testament now rests in us, fills with us. The New Testament teaches us that God wants to partner, that just as God partnered with Moses and his people to bring about his purposes, that God also wants to partner with us. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 says this, "For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Jesus Christ. And so we can do good, so that we can do the good things that he planned for us long ago." So this is Moses. This is his story. And we learn about his story so we can learn about our story. That it doesn't matter what kind of choices we've made or how low we've gone or what type of wilderness we're walking in, God is still not done with us. And maybe there's some choices that have taken your life down a road that you're not happy with and you know God isn't happy with. But you need to understand that God is still at work in your life. And today is one of those moments where he's calling us back. And he's stirring you. God is looking for men and women who will yield to his purposes to seize the day for his glory. And the simple question is this. We're not asking you to be like Moses. You want to model your life after somebody? Do it after Jesus. The question today is, will you yield to the purposes of God in your life as Moses eventually learned? Let's pray. Father, I thank you that you are at work. Paul in the New Testament reminds us that nothing separates us from your love, that you are with us. That, Lord, that no matter the dumb choices we've made in life, you are still at work. You are faithful, and we are free. That old life, the Exodus story reminds us you have freed us. We aren't slaves, and you are calling us to enter into the promised land. And so today, Lord, help us to grab hold of your faithfulness. Help us to obey. Help us bring a Jethro family into our life that can point us. Help us to get rid of the pride and listen to others who are trying to help us. Forgive us of where our pride has held us back. Humble us. And let our heart hurt for the things that hurt your heart. And help us to enter the promised land. In your name.